This is The Rundown, your weekly news and review from Western Mass. I'm Carrie Saldo. It's Friday. February, where are we? It's spring, March 27th, 2026, everyone. Our rundowners this week: Elizabeth Roman, executive editor of NEPM News, reporter emeritus Paul Tudhill, and Matt Zafransky, editor-in-chief of Western Mass Politics and Insight. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
If you have thoughts, email the rundown at nepm.org. Coming up, our panel digs into what's going on with the job cuts at Hampden County Sheriff's Office and Springfield's efforts to claw back climate grants cut by the Trump administration. Those are going to be hitting federal court. First, some wider context for this week's news: whether government employees working without pay for 42 days will start getting paid finally is in the hands of the House of Representatives. This after the Senate struck a deal early this morning regarding how the partial government shutdown might come to an end. And yesterday, Thursday, Liz, was Equal Pay Day, unequal pay day as I regard it. The annual observance marks how far into the new year women have to work to make the same amount of money earned by our male counterparts. Andrea Shue from NPR had some great reporting on that this week. Meanwhile, some other employment news from the 413. The headline: Hampden County Sheriff's workers and services will be scarcer after cuts announced this week. At least 50 jobs will be impacted, either by being cut entirely or redefined in some way. Stephanie Berry of the Springfield Republican put it this way, quote, "Members of the Hampden County Sheriff's Department will be a scarcity outside of the walls of its jails in the days to come after deep budget cuts announced Wednesday that follow the state's recent targeting of agency overspending." Elizabeth Roman, Phil Bishop from NEPM took a look at this issue. What's top of mind here for you?
Yeah, he was there. They held a press conference yesterday at the county jail, and he attended. And essentially, it's a really big loss for small programs throughout Western Massachusetts. So you're looking at Palmer, you're looking at West Springfield losing services. Springfield is losing several major services. As a Springfield resident, Forest Park is no longer going to have vehicles on site. And as someone who lives near there and walks there, it's been really nice to have a sheriff department car. You know, when it's dusk and you're walking, and I don't have a dog. I don't always walk with another person. So that'll be gone. The Marine Patrol that they have, summer's coming up. You've got these boats out there, people driving drunk on the water. That program is going to be cut down. Phil was able to talk to 3 women who had jobs as analysts at that new Chicopee AI Crime Watch Center. Their positions are at risk of being cut, and they literally just started. They just opened last month.
And this comes amid some very intense scrutiny from the legislative level. It stems back to last year, us talking about it here on the show. Also, Sheriff Kochi and other sheriffs were at the State House this week. Colin Young reported from the State House News Service that 9 of the 14 sheriffs in the state sat shoulder to shoulder on Tuesday at the legislature's budget writing committee and defended their work and also pledged to be partners in reforming this system. What do you make of this, Paul Tudhill?
Well, this all stems, as you said, the legislature is taking a closer look at the Sheriff's Department's spending. Last fall, the 14 sheriffs came to the legislature and collectively asked for $160 million in supplemental funding, essentially to backfill their budgets, which they had overspent. So the legislature contacted the state inspector general, their new best friend up on Beacon Hill, who does all their dirty work for them now. And Jeff Shapiro last month put out a 62-page preliminary report. And there are a number of interesting findings in here. First of all, he found that the sheriffs don't really have budgets. They get a dollar amount, an appropriation from the state legislature in the annual state budget, which they historically overspend.
It's been a long time song and
right,
dance.
It's been decades. And then they come back to the legislature and they get a supplemental appropriation which backfills everything. Now, the problem with this is that the sheriff's departments are, in essence, deficit spending. And as the inspector general pointed out in his report, there's no statutory authority that allows sheriffs to deficit spend. So that's a big problem. The way they've been conducting this budgeting process is apparently unlawful. The other issue that Shapiro highlighted is that there is apparently a disconnect between legislative leaders and sheriffs over what the role of the sheriff is in public safety. Are they just jail keepers.
Which is certainly not the case in Hampden County in particular.
No,
they run a
but-
number of other programs.
Yes, but what's the authorization for that statutorily? What is the authority that sheriffs have as law enforcement officers? Can they pull somebody over and write a speeding ticket? Can they do drunk driving stops? The Plymouth County Sheriff's Department, I read this week, had to discontinue a department that was going out and collecting crime scene evidence. So,
But do you think, Matt?
and so look, all of these things that the sheriffs do. I mean, I know Cochise, can make a very valid case from a public safety standpoint about all of the good things his department is doing in Hampden County, but is he legally entitled to do this stuff? And these are issues that the legislature and the sheriffs need to work out.
Matt, do you think, to Paul's point, this is kind of a statutory issue? It's a case of what's happening on the ground in current day. The evolution of sheriff's offices hasn't quite caught up with what's on the books.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that this also speaks to the fact that, you go back 40 years and virtually every sheriff's department was a part of a county government. They have been virtually abolished in every county in Massachusetts with, one or two exceptions that don't really make a difference. And so I suppose it's not a surprise they've been operating in a legal gray area, given the fact that they abolished the counties, transferred the sheriffs nominally to the state, and then never bothered to fill in the individual pieces. Now, maybe it wasn't legal if they were doing the exact same things under county law as well when such a thing existed, but it creates a whole another layer of, and ultimately the legislature is responsible. They're the ones that abolished the counties, reasonably so under the circumstances, and then never bothered to be like, oh, what are all these tasks we've suddenly taken onto the state's ledger?
And we heard Worcester County Sheriff Lou Evangelides coming out this week saying, look, the legislature should more clearly define the job, the role of sheriff's offices, and then determine budgets to recognize the difference among the different sheriffs, because it does vary widely. And, Cochise, in particular, Hampden County does a lot of work with helping people who are trying to avoid substance use and not just the typical things you would think about incarceration. Paul, anything else to wrap us up here?
Well, yeah, as you said, there isn't a lot of consistency in terms of what the sheriffs do from department to department. So yeah, yeah. I mean, in a sane world, that would be the way we would want to do things, right? We want to have some consistency in what the sheriffs are authorized and funded for in the state.
Well, and with cuts in like police departments as well, they are helping to fill that in. I mean, Chief Larry Akers was there from Springfield, and it's a service that they can't provide because their department is also struggling with budget cuts.
Yeah, look, there's no question, as Liz pointed out, everybody loves the sheriff's patrols in the park, and they're in there on horseback sometimes, and it's a great look, and it makes people feel good, and it makes people feel safe,
and
it's
selfishly,
it's a terrific program. Nobody's questioning that.
From
I
a
don't think.
practicality standpoint, Palmer, my little town where I live, like a lot of our overnights are covered by the sheriff's office. So
Yeah.
So looking ahead, you mentioned the IG's report, Jeff Shapiro. The final investigation on that is due out May 31st. So obviously won't be the last time we're talking about this on the rundown. We're going to move on and talk about some reporting from Western Mass Politics and Insight. The headline, Climate Grant Showdown for Springfield and its Allies reaches appeals court. Matt, you reported on this for your online site. I'm going to read a bit here. The city of Springfield, several fellow municipalities, and environmental groups tried to convince a Washington appeals court on March 16th to revive a lawsuit to restore climate grants that the Environmental Protection Agency illegally eliminated. Springfield was one of the first recipients of the Environmental and Climate Justice Block Grant Program, mouthful. Yet the city, like many others, lost its grant amid the chaos of the Trump administration slashing last year. Matt, what's the primary argument that the folks are making here?
So the Springfield and a bunch of other municipalities and environmental groups last year sued to get the EPA to give the money back. That suit was dismissed, so they appealed to the D.C. Court of Appeals. An issue that has been looming in the background here, however, is that the big tax cut, I'm only going to say OBBB tax cut bill, swept a bunch of funds that had not been obligated, that is assigned for use. And so there's a question about whether or not that touches the grants that were rescinded, and that there's the big question at the appeals court, and I was there in Washington observing the proceedings. Clearly, is this money even still there as a matter of law? And if it is, then they go to step B and figure out if there's a way they can actually get it all back for the grantees. But the D.C. Circuit, which I should know was a majority Trump panel in this particular Trump-appointed panel in this case, is mostly focusing on, do they even have the money still there? Because I should note there's also a bunch of other funding pulled cases that don't necessarily have this weird tax cut angle to it. That are all going en banc. That is, all judges of the D.C. Circuit are going to be reviewing it, because it has real implications about what the executive can really do in terms of rescinding funds. And in most of these cases, there was Trump majority panels, even though the overall circuit is not Trump majority, making these decisions with huge implications for funding.
What's the federal government saying for its part in this?
Well, I mean, their main argument is first and foremost that when we pulled the money from places like Springfield, it automatically became eligible for what Congress did to sweep the funds to pay for the tax cut bill. That is in severe dispute because there's a process for switching money you've pulled and making it back to being used for something else, or unobligated, as they say. But they also are arguing that even if that is the case, it doesn't matter, because as the district court said, this isn't the right venue for this. You should be going to a different court to try to get this money back, because we basically broke a contract with you. This isn't an administrative procedure or other kind of claim. It's something that goes to a very specialized court. And we've seen this time and time again with the Supreme Court moving these things around. Whether this the situation applies to it or not, I'm not sure.
While the legal eagles sort of work to sort this out, Liz, help me put this in context for the average listener, the average person living in Springfield, who are like, lawsuit, small shoot. How does this affect me?
Yeah, I mean, I actually went back to look at some reporting from Greta Yoakum from the Republican from when that grant was cut and what the things were that were being cut. And it's essentially services for low income and moderate income households that were going to get looked at for lead. Springfield has twice the amount of lead in homes that the rest of the state does. At the asthma issue here, Springfield tends to be at the top of the country. This was for air pollution, reporting. They were also going to do like mold mitigation. Is that what it's called? So there was some of that. It was for tree cover since 2011 when we had that tornado. There's still areas of the city that have no tree coverage whatsoever. So this was looking at like 1,500 trees in the city. So
which could also help with the air quality
issue.
Which
is a major issue. So it's also looking at like the West Street issue. So where you're crossing over into the Memorial or to the North End Bridge in West Springfield. That area has like a lot of safety concerns. When the Biggie time is there, it's like the traffic is horrible. It was really going to affect everyday people quite a bit to have this money.
Paul Todd-Hill, where are you landing on this one?
Two words that you never want to have in a grant application if you want money from the Trump administration: climate and justice. Those were obviously just automatically flagged, and the money got pulled, and now it's tied up in these legal concerns, which Matt has very expertly outlined.
Yeah. Well, it also speaks to like the chaos that we've had, like as reporters and in the newsrooms, like executive order comes out and suddenly the EPA is pulling back all of this funding, and then the next day a judge is saying no, you have to put it back. So where does that money go? Where do those decisions land? And most of the time it affects like the average American who really needs access to this kind of money. So it's really disappointing.
The Trump administration, for its part, basically made the argument back when it cut the grants. It's sort of streamlining its priorities, felt like these were no longer appropriate. And so that's where the Trump administration sits on this one. Where does this go from here, Matt?
Well, I think there's two possibilities, and they kind of outline this in the case. One is that if they find that actually the money still does exist, that it wasn't swept to pay for the Trump's tax bill, then it still exists and they're obligated to use the money. Because that's the interesting thing that the proponents made, is that when they passed the tax bill, they didn't repeal the program. They just said any money that hasn't been assigned, essentially, is used to pay for the tax bill. So if the money is still there, then the EPA is obligated to spend it, and the hope would be is that a lot of the original grantees will be able to get their money back. So I mean, and then there, like I said, there is this bigger question about how the Trump administration has been playing with the spending generally. That's going to be going up in front of the full DC circuit. So if they survive that tax cut sweeping part, that case is ultimately probably going to decide where this case goes from there and whether it can go back to a district court.
Folks can check it out on Western Mass Politics and Insight. All right, still ahead, our panel on lawmakers decrying inequities in a system that they alone have the authority to change, and an update on rail service in the region, including the latest on a planned train stop in Palmer, plus scoops, praise, and predictions. If you have thoughts, email therundown@nepm.org. You are listening to The Rundown on 88.5 NEPM. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. I am Carrie Saldo, joined by journalists Paul Tuthill, Matt Safransky, and Elizabeth Roman. Let's jump right back into it this morning. Headline: Mass 12 K-12 school funding approach creating chorus of complaints. Jill Kaufman among the folks who reported on this out of NEPM this week. Quoting her, "The survival of Massachusetts public school students is at stake." That's what Beacon Hill lawmakers told top education officials on Monday at a joint Ways and Means hearing. Then Sam Drysdale from the State House News Service called it this way: lawmakers from both sides of the aisle vented about the Chapter 70 school funding formula that they say is failing their school districts. He went on to say that there was this central tension of the day, a feedback loop of frustration, urgency, and responsibility as lawmakers decried inequities in a system that they alone have the authority to rewrite. The authority is in the hands of state legislatures. So what gives, Paul?
Well, so the Chapter 70 funding formula was revised significantly as a result of the Student Opportunity Act of 2019. And this is the first significant increase in state local school funding since a big Education Reform Act back in the 1990s. The aim of the Student Opportunity Act was to increase funding to schools with high numbers of low-income families, non-English speakers, students with disabilities. So schools in Springfield, Chicopee, Holyoke, Pittsfield, to name a few, saw sizable increases in their state funding. But the issue now is that many suburban and rural districts contend that the amount of money they're receiving has not kept pace with their costs. And so now these schools are threatened with cuts and local votes on property tax cap overrides, Prop 2.5 overrides, which are apparently going to take place at record numbers across the state this spring.
Hang on, I just want to bring in State Senator Jake Oliveira from Ludlow really put a fine point on what you're saying at the hearing. He talked about how Ludlow in particular is very hard hit. He pointed out that Springfield and Chicopee have seen in the last 5 years 35 and 38% increases in their Chapter 70 funding. Meanwhile, Ludlow, 6%.
Yeah, the Chapter 70 funding formula is politically divisive. It's, is evidence of the fact that up until 2019, there hadn't really been a significant reform in it since the 1990s. And the issue that legislators always explained to me was you never want to be perceived as voting for something that is going to take money away from a school in your district and give it to somebody else.
Feedback loop that Sam Drysdale was talking about, where they're complaining about it, but they're also not doing much about it.
Well, but the solution that they came up with, the quote-unquote solution they came up with in 2019 was to increase money for everybody. So in other words, we're not taking money away from Ludlow and giving it to Springfield. We're increasing by $1.7 billion over the next 7 years money for all of the schools in Massachusetts. It's just that these schools with these particular problems that are suffering from these enormous achievement gaps that we've seen well documented, these schools are going to get more resources than the more well-off suburban schools, but the suburban schools are still going to get more money. The problem is that the increases haven't kept pace with the costs.
And this is something that State Rep Todd Smola, who has who covers districts Hampden and Hampshire counties, he kind of spoke at the hearing about the perfect storm that's happening right now. You talked about it, Paul, the Proposition 2.5 overrides that we're seeing. But he also talked about the couple with this year's tough budget times, whether that's the Prop 2.5 overrides that we're seeing. And he used some sort of less than subtle words to frame all of this.
We are all being hit in the face with a shovel this year because we have never seen its equal in terms of local municipalities begging us for some sort of relief.
Hit in the face with a shovel, Liz.
Jill and I were talking about that. She was listening to the hearing, and she was like, "Oh, there's just so many great quotes to be used because people are really passionate about it." Then you've got like Rep. Lindsay Sabadosa saying like, "We're not going to change the statute until you guys get us a funding formula that we think is worth changing the statute for." And Desi is saying, "Well, we can't change. We can't do anything until we get a statute change."
That's the state education department,
right?
Desi.
Yeah. So it's just like a lot of back and forth, and certainly made for good radio, I would say. But I don't know how much it's helping the school districts.
Matt Zafransky, what about for you? What are you watching here?
Well, I mean, I think, there's also, the point that was made in that hearing is that, they are the lawmakers. Like, they don't have to wait for Desi to do everything. And I think it speaks to, I don't want to call it learned helplessness. That's not quite the right phrase. That is insulting even for the legislature. But they could make the decision themselves. They do have the resources to find out, how they can fund it, how they can change it to fix some of these problems. Maybe there's like a backstop that can help, communities that are facing a sudden surge in costs. And, I think another part of it is it probably is especially aggravating here in Western Massachusetts because the economy is not as good here. So people will feel Prop 2.5 increases more. They don't have the same economic input that provides more money to schools on a regular basis. That disparity, it makes it a lot harder for both the rural districts and even some of the suburban districts around the cities in comparison to anywhere in Metro Boston.
Now, the acting Massachusetts Secretary of Education, Amy Kershaw, responded to what she was hearing from legislators, kind of saying there are two opposing things going on here. This is a strong budget for education, but then she also added this.
Our districts, our families, our child care programs are struggling with energy costs and inflation costs that are unaffordable for them.
And health care. I mean, it really all comes down to the fact that I shouldn't say it's all health care, but a lot of it has to do with the cost of health care and insurance, providing the insurance to teachers and other school
That's
employees.
often the biggest chunk of a budget.
Yeah, it's a budget buster. There's no question about it. And we know that the health costs in Massachusetts, the utility costs in Massachusetts, they're all rising way faster than the rate of inflation. And I think I'd have to go back and double check this figure, but I was reading it yesterday as part of the research for the show. Was I believe that the increase to districts like Ludlow was around like 5%.
6%.
Okay,
6%.
6% annually. Okay. It's not keeping pace with the cost of inflation.
No.
Well, and if you're looking at facilities maintenance as well, a lot of suburban and particularly rural schools just don't have the money to pick up the infrastructure, and they have buildings that are from the 40s or the 50s that don't have any of the new energy efficient necessities that you have now in order to save on costs.
And they can't get an 80-20 split for cost the way
Right.
that Springfield or other cities, poorer cities, can.
And the last thing, I'll close us here, is any rural school district listening to this conversation right now is also probably screaming, and we are not reimbursed for transportation costs in a way that is helpful to our budgets. That's been a huge issue. All right. We will keep talking about this, I'm quite sure. Moving on this morning, though, our final headline of the morning, Mass DOT, Connecticut working on hourly trains from Springfield to NYC. 1 million more riders possible. That was the headline in the Springfield Republican on Jim Kinney's reporting about this. And he said Mass DOT planners, Connecticut and Amtrak are talking about an hourly train service from Springfield to New York City that could boost ridership. Like I said, 1 million passengers a year, but there's a catch. There would need to be upgrades to tracks. Springfield's Union Station and Amtrak fleet of trains would need some support. Meredith Schlesinger, the Mass DOT person who was speaking about this, told the Massachusetts Department of Transportation Board of Directors last week. This was part of an update she gave, and Kinney was checking in on it. What about East West Rail, folks? No.
Well, yeah, I mean, this all sounds great, right? And it would be great if and when it comes to fruition, but there is no timetable for any of this, and there is no money for any of this. And, many of us around this table have had a long history in covering East-West Rail. I mean, they've been talking about it for decades. Now we finally have money and we finally have a plan for it. It's finally moving forward. So, hold off on all the boards for the hourly service to New York City.
One of the first reporter shadows that I did when I started at the Republican when I was 19 was going to Union Station and talking to Representative Neal about his big plans. Which, I mean, the Union Station has come to fruition. Adam Frenier spoke with him from our newsroom yesterday, and he's excited about the prospect, the fact that Springfield is in the conversation. He called Springfield the crossroads of New England, and there's so many possibilities there. But again, I think we're all a little jaded because 19, I'm 42 now. So maybe another decade or two.
Well, I think one of the important takeaways that I had from that hearing was actually less about the hourly service and more that you finally are getting a clearer picture about what it's going to look like when East-West Rail starts up and what it's going to take for it to be more than what they've already promised. And that's going to be a lot. As Paul said, there's no money for it. In the case of the Springfield track realignment, MassDOT confirmed to me they don't even have a budget or cost for that yet. They will have one this year, they claim, but we don't have it yet. We just have money for studying. So
you need the cost before you can even dream about a budget.
Right. Exactly. And I think that, this also goes back to a term that we don't talk about as much, which is compass rail, which is what they folded East-West Rail into. That Springfield's going to become this node for service to other places.
Which is that crossroads piece, too, that Congressman Neal was speaking of, because the idea is you're looking at a compass when you look down at the map and seeing all the different directions that train routes are going north-south, east-west.
Exactly. I mean, I would imagine that if we have, because the thing people have to remember is that the first trains from Boston to Springfield are actually going to New Haven. They're going via Springfield, so you can connect Hartford and Worcester as well as other places. So, I mean, it's a process, and it provided some clarity that I think we haven't had for a while, but there's still so much more we need to know. And I think we also do need to ask some questions about the pace at which some of this is going, especially the parts that are funded. There are reasons why it's taking some time, but I think there could be a lot more explanation why, we're almost 4 years after they got the grant to make East-West Rail happen, and they still haven't put a shovel in the ground.
One of the interesting things for me was that MassDOT told Jim Kinney that ridership at Massachusetts stations roughly doubled between 2018 and 2025. So perhaps some bolstering or a shot in the arm for these ideas to keep moving forward, if not full speed ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question the demand is there. Now they've got to meet it with the supply.
The Hartford line running between, which is both a ConnDOT and Connecticut Department of Transportation and the Amtrak program, recovered fastest of any Connecticut service after the pandemic. They're already exceeding their 2019 numbers, whereas some of the Connecticut services still struggle after the pandemic.
And with the economy, with gas prices now, people want to ride a train.
Exactly.
If you can get accessible transportation, that's always going to be the better option.
Always loved reading a book on a train. All right, let's head on to Scoops, Praise, and Prediction portion of the show. Paul Tothill, I'll start with you this morning.
Well, I just want to highlight something that I read this week. With the arrival of the new baseball season, I can commiserate with fans who may find it confusing and expensive to follow their teams in this age of streaming. MLB has games on Amazon Prime, Apple TV, NBC Peacock, ESPN, Fox, Netflix, and regional services. The Athletic calculated this week that it would take at least 5 subscriptions and cost just over $1,000 for fans of the New York Yankees to watch each of the team's 162 games this season.
He didn't mention the Red Sox. Matt Safransky.
I'm going to praise actually to the Greenfield Recorder, which has been covering the involving First Franklin race quite extensively. I've have not been able to cover it myself as much as I would like, and it's shaping up to be a very interesting race, even if there's some people who have a stronger chance than others.
Yeah. Briefly, Ms. Ramon.
Nirvani Williams and I will be at BookCon in April, so we'll be interviewing some local Western Mass authors, and we're hoping that people who are going to be out there who love books, it's a big national convention out there from Western Mass, hit us up. We'll interview you when we're there.
Elizabeth Roman, Matt Safransky, and Paul Tothill. Thanks so much this morning. I'm Carrie Saldo. Have a great Friday, everybody.